Tonight, America mourns the loss of civil rights icon Reverend Jesse Jackson. His family says Jackson died peacefully early this morning, surrounded by those he loved. Jackson's public life lasted more than 50 years. He worked alongside Dr. Martin Luther King and founded the Rainbow Push Coalition, whose mission was equality for all. He nearly became the Democratic nominee for president in 1988. Jackson was also a powerful advocate of D.C. and D.C. statehood, becoming the first elected shadow senator. Ed O'Keefe looks back on Jackson's life and legacy.
The people must unite to save humanity.
The preacher, civil rights activist, and presidential candidate was born in Greenville, South Carolina in 1941.
I was born next door to a white church. I could only attend as a janitor.
In his 20s, Jesse Jackson gained national attention as an aide to Martin Luther King Jr. and a leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
A shot cracked out from across the street, dropping him to the floor.
He was in Memphis on April 4, 1968, when King was assassinated.
The white people's best friend is dead.
King's murder sparked tension between Jackson and other civil rights leaders as they struggled over who would lead their movement. Ultimately, Jackson launched his own organizations that later became the Rainbow Push Coalition, still advocating today for black economic and political empowerment.
We shall fight this institutional racism wherever we see it.
He also became an international hostage negotiator. In 1984, he helped win the release of an American pilot from Syria. Later, he'd broker freedom for Americans held in Cuba, Iraq, and Kosovo.
To the White House!
His activism and diplomacy buoyed Jackson's first campaign for president in 1984.
We do not just need a new president, we need a new direction. Our leaders are talking too little to too many leaders in this world.
Jackson ended up placing a stronger than expected third in the Democratic primary. In 1988, his second campaign focused on increasing government spending and U.S. support for the Third World. But he came up short once again.
We must never surrender. America will get better and better.
After campaign politics, Jackson was a talk show host and was an early supporter, but occasional critic, of Barack Obama's presidential bid, famously photographed in Chicago's Grant Park on election night, 2008. Initially diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, Jackson revealed in 2025 he'd been battling progressive supranuclear palsy, a long-term degenerative brain condition. But his public appearances continued, more as a supporter of a new generation of activists
in the filibuster,
fighting for voting rights, fair housing, and police reform. Echoing the same message he spent years preaching.
And nobody can stop us now. Moving on up. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive.
In a statement, the Jackson family says, quote, his unwavering belief in justice, equality, and love uplifted millions, and we ask you to honor his memory by continuing the fight for the values he lived by. All services commemorating Jackson's life will be held in his home city of Chicago. Ed O'Keefe, CBS News, Washington.
And tonight we want to focus more on how Jackson's life continues to influence modern civil rights advocacy. Joining us now is George Mason University professor and political scientist Michael Fauntleroy to discuss the impact that Reverend Jackson had on D.C. and the nation. Professor Fauntleroy, thanks for making time for us this evening.
Well, it's always good to see you, Leslie.
You know, you spend a lot of time in front of young people, and you have done this for many years. And I wonder what you tell them now about what they need to understand about Reverend Jackson's legacy, particularly in today's political climate.
Well, it's really interesting how this particular case is sort of juxtaposed theory and practice. I teach a course on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons on the American presidency. And so I spent a few minutes today, in fact, talking to my students, most of whom are 18 to 22 years old and have no real knowledge of Jesse Jackson. And one of the points that I was trying to make today was that he has a unique distinction of somebody who ran for president, lost, but still had a long tail legacy, if you will, creating opportunities for other people to come in his wake. When you think about people like Ron Brown, who cut his teeth on Jesse's 1984 and 1988 campaigns and later got Bill Clinton across the finish line in 1992 as chairman of the Democratic National Committee, or all of the people that were elected in the 80s and into the 90s based on voter registration efforts in support of Jesse Jackson's campaigns. You're talking about somebody who has helped to sort of memorialize a certain kind of progressive Black politics that we haven't seen since and might not see again anytime soon.
Yeah, a lot of the young people that you teach know about President Obama, but they may not have realized the path that was laid for President Obama and how it was paved by Jesse Jackson. You know, he did some incredible work with his Rainbow Coalition, really planting seeds and laying the groundwork for what democracy and the Democratic Party look like today.
So again, this is really interesting in that names and faces continue over time. I showed my students a picture of Jesse Jackson shaking the hand of a younger Bernie Sanders in 1988. Bernie Sanders was one of his biggest supporters in both 1984 and 1988 campaigns. They sort of bonded on the Rainbow Coalition concept that Jackson had created, in which people from various backgrounds came together around a certain set of progressive principles. Well, my students have no sense of that. And so being able to share that and use this as an example of how domestic electoral presidential politics can work is a great tribute to Jesse in some ways, because it shows that he did something beyond just running. He inspired several people from a variety of different perspectives to organize, be active, run for office, and pave the way for people like Barack Obama.
Let's talk a bit more about Jackson's national prominence, obviously those two presidential cycles where he ran, how that helped to elevate D.C.'s political importance on the national stage. D.C., which had been so disenfranchised back then, still is now, but certainly more back then.
So this is really interesting. You look at the arc of Jesse Jackson post 1968. He sort of was trying to figure out where to land his career, so to speak, in terms of advocacy. And the 1984 and 1988 campaigns, particularly the 1984 one, was seen more as sort of an ego-driven kind of thing for him, almost a personality play of sorts. But as the 88 campaign came on, he showed a broader range of ideas, speaking out on several issues beyond just what some folks thought a Black presidential candidate would. And he comes much closer to the nomination in 1988 than he did in 1984. But then the question becomes, well, what happens next? A 1992 campaign wasn't really in the cards. I think everybody understood he sort of hit a ceiling. And that's where D.C. comes into play. He moves to D.C. Near Howard University, right off 4th Street, and begins to get involved in local politics. He runs for shadow senator, in part because there was some momentum toward giving D.C. representation in the Senate. And he, was angling for some of that, if you will. But his advocacy for D.C. was actually pretty important and very helpful in supporting some of the people who had been in D.C. for years moving in that space. And so Jesse Jackson, local in D.C., national around the country, and internationally, as the Ed O'Keefe piece showed us, he played a significant role. And I should just add quickly, he was also a real agitator for the ending of apartheid in South Africa, something that the piece didn't mention, but certainly is warranted here.
Indeed. Can we stay a little bit with this activism and this intersection here with D.C. and the fight for statehood and greater representation in Congress? Because he had framed D.C. disenfranchisement back then as a moral failure of American democracy. And so it was a powerful frame with which to view it. I wonder if you think he succeeded in some way in elevating this issue of D.C. statehood on the national stage.
Right. Yes, I think he did, in that he made it a core principle of his 1988 campaign. Unfortunately, though, history has shown that America's attention span around these kinds of issues is kind of short. So, there was a period where the iron was hot, so to speak, and that was the time to strike. And there were some attempts to do that, but over time, the iron cooled, and so we don't feel the same way about it the way we used to, particularly in terms of certain generations. If you're of a certain generation, you remember this as part of the Democratic left, if you will, ideal or set of principles, but that has sort of worn off over the years.
Let's talk about when historians look back decades from now, how they will remember the impact of Jesse Jackson.
Well, I think it's difficult to look back on the last quarter of the 20th century American presidential electoral politics and not be able to discuss Jesse Jackson at some level. He moved the Democratic Party toward a more open viewpoint around certain kinds of issues, social issues, and such. And so he's worthy of some praise in that regard. And while I know for some people, who are under, say, 40, for example, or perhaps certainly under 30, he had been off the scene for a while as they were coming to their own understanding of American politics, which is why it's so important now in this moment to use it as an education point to show people that political movements ebb and flow, certain principles ebb and flow, but they are powerful voices that keep things on the public radar in ways that are certainly important and necessary. And again, you can't talk about the last quarter of the 20th century American politics, American presidential electoral politics, and not have a conversation about Jesse Jackson. So for me, that is evidence of his importance in the overall American political landscape.
I know that for many of us, Jesse Jackson is an icon, but for you and your family, he is family. And so can you tell me a bit more about the family connection and what you're feeling personally today?
Thank you for mentioning that. My first vote for president was in 1984, and I voted for Jesse Jackson, knowing he had no chance of winning. Right. And I understood that. But this was a protest vote. I wanted to make a statement based on my own sort of political socialization in my own family with my parents and, of course, my Uncle Walter and others who were close to us, many of whom knew Jesse Jackson. And, to be frank, there's some people who had some misgivings about him, but I know for a fact that my uncle thought that he represented a kind of politics that America desperately needed, and so my uncle appreciated him. I just saw him a week or so ago and haven't had a chance to connect with him on this, and I'd be curious to get his thoughts. But yes, there is no question there are connections. Some of our viewers may know that Jesse Jackson Jr. and at least one of Jesse Jackson Sr.'s sons graduated from St. Albans School here in D.C. And so the Jackson family connections to DC are deep, and I can also say there's certainly some connections with my family. I don't have it handy, but I wish I had the picture I took with him at the commemoration march or the March on Washington some time ago. I'm sitting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with him and my uncle and Coretta Scott King and Eleanor Holmes Norton, and it was a moment for me that I'll always remember fondly.
You mention names like the Eleanor Holmes Nortons of the world, and I think about all these icons. Obviously, she is still here, but all these icons who were of Jackson's day, who are leaving us, and how important it is to remember that legacy and to talk to them and to learn from them. And so as we close, I wonder, where do you see Jackson's legacy most alive today?
That's a great question. I think in the Democratic Party, there are people who I would call sort of the godchildren of Jesse Jackson, in that they are pushing for a political party to be more inclusive, to be more cognizant of the least of these, so to speak. And so, I got to ask this question earlier today: who are the next Jesse Jacksons? Remember, he came to a national prominence with something called the Rainbow Coalition. And so when I think about people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think about people like Zoran Mamdani in New York and the current mayor of Chicago and the current mayor of Baltimore. And I think about people who are sort of cut from that cloth. And so as we go forward, we have to make sure that the bench continues to remain deep for those of us who care about these issues and make sure that Jackson's politics and the politics of that entire generation, not just Jackson, isn't forgotten.
Grateful for all of their sacrifices and grateful for your time, Professor Fauntleroy, for sharing not just your knowledge of this, but the personal connections and how you are feeling today. I'm sure your students are glad to have you at the forefront sharing your vast knowledge with them.
Well, thank you for that. My students have a test on Thursday. I'm not so sure they're in love with me right now, but yes, but thank you for that.
Oh, good to talk to you.
Likewise.
So Roland Martin knew Reverend Jackson well and worked alongside him in key moments, sharing stages and conversations with him throughout the fight for social justice. Annie Yu spoke with him earlier today.
I want to give you a moment to reflect on the passing of Reverend Jesse Jackson, not only someone you worked with closely, but a friend.
Look, I cover Reverend Jackson. I've been a journalist my entire life, and Reverend, he understood the media very well. He was absolutely a towering figure, one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century. Beyond his oratory, beyond the last 7 minutes of that speech at the Democratic National Convention in 1988 was one of the best I've ever heard in my entire life. But when you look at going from growing up in South Carolina and then going to college in North Carolina A&T, and then being an aide to Dr. King. Dr. King references Reverend Jackson in his last sermon on April 3rd, 1968, at the mountaintop speech in Mason Temple. And he picks up the mantle, Operation Breadbasket, driving economic opportunities for so many Black businesses. That was critically important. And then, of course, you go into the 80s. Harold Washington run for mayor of Chicago, Congressman Harold Washington, and it was Run Harold Run, and that morphed into Run Jesse Run on the national level. And here's the thing that people understand. If there's no Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. changing the Democratic Party's rules in 1988, there is no President Barack Obama, because Hillary Clinton won the large states in 2008. And so Reverend Jackson had those rules changed. And people need to understand, he was fighting up until his last breath. In November, many of us got the report that he was days away from passing away, and I cut a vacation short, flew back from Bermuda, went to see him on November 16th, and we're sitting at his bedside, holding his hand, and we're talking, and he tells his son, Yusef, Coke, because he had just started to take some food, and he said, well, no, Reverend, you can't just have water. He says, no Coke. And we're talking about the Target boycott and stuff that's going on, and then Reverend is using one where he's saying, preachers, meeting, Friday, food, the poor. And so he began to literally come to life. The doctors were shocked because they said, man, his organs were failing. So being around people and listen to us talk about what was happening in the world began to sort of revive him. And so that's who he was. This man was committed. Here he was on his deathbed in November, talking about calling a meeting 5 days later for preachers across the country to join together to provide food for the poor and the hungry. That's who this man was.
A remarkable person indeed. Reverend Jackson was a national figure, but he left a deep imprint on communities here in the DMV. From your perspective,
actually international.
Yeah,
people understand.
Beyond, global.
When he traveled the world, Reverend Jackson was treated like a head of state. Allison Payne, who was an anchor in Chicago, something happened in Israel with her and her film crew. She didn't call the State Department. She didn't call the White House. She called Reverend Jackson. And within an hour, he was on the phone with the top government officials in Israel, and that issue got resolved. And I long said, if anything happened and I traveled around the world and I need to make one phone call, that would be Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson Sr. That's so a lot of us in America, I think part of the problem, he was so familiar because you would see him at a rally and a protest and this banquet or whatever. But He was a beloved figure. Europe, South America, Africa, in numerous countries around the world. That's how major this guy was.
How should history remember Reverend Jesse Jackson and carry forward from his work and message?
You talk about a continuum. A. Philip Randolph, Dr. King, Reverend Jackson. He picked up that economic mantle of Reverend Jackson. And so here he was, locked and loaded on civil rights, economic rights. But folks should go back and listen to his 84 and 88 speeches. He was talking about issues in that race that you didn't hear Democrats discuss till 20, 25 years later. And so he was a smart and brilliant man. And so again, everyone has faults. Everyone has frailties. He drove some folks crazy. But you know what, though? When you needed somebody to be in your corner, to fight corporate America, to fight for the disenfranchised and the poor, that's Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson Sr. And I'm telling you right now, he is irreplaceable. There is no one today that can match the stature, the relationships, the connection between civil rights and human rights and economic rights and world leaders, all the way down to a poor black woman in Alabama, a poor white person in West Virginia. That's who Reverend Jackson was. And I'm telling you, people really do not give him his proper flowers, but many of us did. And that was not a moment where I emceed a program or I was on the program and he was in the room, but I did not stop the program and say, give this man his full respect for what he has done for us. And that was always the case with Reverend Jackson.
All right, we will leave it there. A journalist and host of the Roland Martin Unfiltered Daily Digital Show. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.